Hi guys, welcome to Australian Skies. Not a week goes by where we don't receive an email or a private message asking us about Pine Gap, or as it is sometimes known, Australia's Area 51. So we've made a small video series giving you a bit of an introduction to the history of Pine Gap. The story of Pine Gap started in 1966. The idea was sold to us as being a joint research space facility between the United States government and the Australian government. Now, at the time, the United States already had several US military bases in Australia, but what was going to make Pine Gap unique was that this was to be a jointly owned and run facility between the US and Australia. But even before the contracts were signed, there was already something sketchy going on. Check this out.
The man responsible for setting up Pine Gap was Richard Stallings. According to the Foreign Affairs Department in Canberra, Stallings was working for the United States Department of Defence. As far as the Australian government was aware, Pine Gap was to be a joint facility run by the Defence Departments of Australia and the United States. Unknown to the Australian government, Richard Stallings was working for the CIA, and the CIA was to run Pine Gap. Stallings and another senior CIA man, Victor Marchetti, drafted the Pine Gap Treaty, laying out the ground rules for cooperation between the two governments. Victor Marchetti explains further.
The treaty is the trade-off. In return for your real estate and your logistical support, etc., we will share all the information we acquired for this technical project with you.
Go ahead now.
Information derived from the research programs conducted at the facility shall be shared by the two governments.
Under the sharing arrangements of the Pine Gap Treaty, anything of interest to Australian intelligence was to be passed straight to ASIO.
So why was the US and Australian governments so keen to have a jointly owned facility like Pine Gap? Well, because of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the US was needing to build these types of bases around the world and was essentially looking to rent space. Australia, on the other hand, had plenty of rental space, but not much muscle, and thought it might be a smart move to start ingraining themselves with their allies, especially with the threat of nuclear war looming. On the surface, it seemed like a marriage made in heaven.
Many of you might not know that the Australian government has insisted upon a certain rental, which we Americans must pay for the use of this base. As a businessman, I must admit that the rent is very reasonable. It is, in fact, precisely 1 peppercorn per year to be paid upon demand. Here then, Mr. Prime Minister, I want to present you with 1 peppercorn payment in full for the first year's rent. I thank you very much.
So a decision was made to build Pine Gap right in the middle of Australia, approximately 11 miles outside the town of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, right on Aboriginal land. The Aranda people were never asked their opinion or let alone their permission for a huge war-making facility to be located on their traditional lands. And the rest of Australia was left wondering if our government had just painted a huge target on our foreheads.
What do we want? US bases out! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? US
There are a group of concerned citizens here who campaign against the base on very many occasions.
We've always been stressing that the base is a nuclear target, and they've always denied it. They've either denied it by not answering, or they've just come straight out and denied it.
The Australian government has consistently denied that Pine Gap and Narunga would be nuclear targets.
So for us Aranda people, land isn't something you make yours by sticking a fence around it. It's a spiritual place, and we belong to it. Where we started, and where we'll all end up. And just over that range, that's one of our most sacred valleys. Only thing is, we can't go there anymore. Pine Gap's a spy base. All of America's intel and Russia, China, the Middle East, India, Pakistan, and North Korea comes from all just down that road.
So what's so sacred about down there?
Well, for thousands of years, the Pine Gap Valley was where our people gathered to talk to the stars. Most people outside of Alice Springs don't even know Pine Gap exists, which is just the way the government likes it. Because anything America uses Pine Gap for, Australia is automatically involved in too.
Pine Gap officially became active in 1970 and would need a staff of approximately 800 to 1,000 people to keep it operating, half Australian and half American. So US staff and their families were shipped into Alice Springs and became part of the community.
114? You think that there ought to be some sort of civil defence organised for Alice Springs?
It's a hard question. I guess I don't really have an opinion.
But you live here, you must.
I don't feel any concern.
The few examples that we know about where base employees have violated this code, they've been pretty severely and quickly dealt with, and so there's not a wise thing to express any views on any topics like this. They're here for the job, they're here to make money, they're here presumably because they believe in the particular concept of the base.
However, the honeymoon period for the new joint facility would be brief. In 1972, Australia elected a new government and a new Prime Minister by the name of Gough Whitlam. Now, Whitlam had promised that he would make sure the Pine Gap would become more transparent.
After 23 years of Conservative rule, Australians had elected as Prime Minister the Labor leader, Edward Gough Whitlam.
In opposition, you and Mr. Barnard both raised the question of the American military installations in Australia, with particular reference to the secrecy surrounding them. Could you at this time, sir, indicate the policy your government will take on these questions?
There now need be no secrecy, because Mr. Barnard and I can find out whatever we want to.
Good luck with that. As you can imagine, a new Prime Minister saying things like this is going to make the CIA more than a little nervous.
The CIA didn't have very good knowledge of Australia, even though they have one of their most important facilities in this country, and that's Pine Gap. This led to their paranoia. It's a vital facility for them. Their misunderstanding of Whitlam led them to think that he would remove it from Australia, or that there was a danger the Labor government might remove it.
By 1974, the CIA was having second thoughts about sharing intelligence with Australia.
It was at this time that the CIA made a decision that would trigger a series of events that would have huge consequences, not just here in Australia and the US, but right around the world.
Project Argus is a project designed by the CIA to cut the Australians out of certain information being acquired through the Rhyolite project. They were either going to add channels to the Rhyolite system, and then the Australians would no longer be privy to, or they were going to cut the Australians out of the existing information that was coming down from Rhyolite. But in any case, it was a screw the Aussies type project.
In late 1974, a young man by the name of Christopher Boyce joined TRW, an aerospace and weapons company with close links to the CIA. Working as a telex operator and a cipher clerk in Los Angeles, Boyce found himself handling some of the US government's most sensitive communications, a lot of which was coming from Pine Gap, and it dealt with the CIA's plan to monitor the Australian government and depose the Prime Minister of Australia.
Inside the Black Vault at TRW in Los Angeles, Chris Boyce monitored the CIA's activities during this election. Boyce later told what he had found out to Victor Marchetti.
He learned that the CIA was bribing labor union leaders and providing funds to manipulate the elections. And this was one of the things that turned him off. He said to himself, if we do these kinds of things to our own allies, then what kind of a moral government do we have?
There's a lot more to this story, with books written, and even a movie was released in 1985 called The Falcon and the Snowman, starring Timothy Hutton and Sean Penn, and I suggest you look it up. However, for Australia and Pine Gap, this all culminated on the 11th of November 1975 with the dismissal from office of the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam of the Australian Labor Party by the Governor-General Sir John Kerr, who then commissioned the Leader of the Opposition, Malcolm Fraser of the Liberal Party, as caretaker Prime Minister of Australia.
Strikes are spreading through Australia as workers protest the unprecedented dismissal of the Labor government of Gough Whitlam. Australia's Governor-General John Kerr made the move, and his secretary made the announcement to a very hostile crowd.
Word on the street was that the CIA was allegedly behind it all.
The CIA don't do these things for their health and just to play games. There's a goal there, and the goal, is, I think, was to get rid of Whitlam. That was the whole purpose, I think, was to bring in somebody that they were much closer with and could feel would be more reliable and see things more their way.
Thanks for watching episode 1. We'll see you next time for episode 2.